My area of interest or focus for my research career is photochemistry, and I'm quite humbled to follow the previous talk. The examples that were given early on in the talk about photoisomerization of azobenzenes were stimulating my thinking when I was a graduate student. So it is, I think, quite important to remember that sometimes these simple ideas can be very important and have long-range impact in people's thinking. Today I'm going to talk about an entirely different subject, and one that my group has been working on for about 10 years in a collaboration. And the title captures the concept we're working towards the production of solar fuels through the design of systems that I'll describe today that we call Chromophore-Catalyst assemblies. The work that I'm going to talk about represents the work of a large group working together. In the U.S. currently we have a program that's being sponsored by the Department of Energy called the EFRC program, Energy Frontier Research Centers. And there's currently about 40 EFRCs in various areas of energy science. And the one that I'll be talking about is led by Tom Meyer at the University of North Carolina. We call it the Solar Fuels EFRC. And as you can see from this photo that was taken a couple of years ago, there's about 50 people working together, about 15 PIs, and roughly a group of 30 or 40 graduate students and postdocs. We're all working together on science to try to solve the problem of converting light into chemical potential. And of course, the inspiration of this comes from natural photosynthesis. This slide probably doesn't need introduction to most of you, but just to reiterate the concept that what plants do is they take in sunlight as energy, and they use it in effect to reduce carbon dioxide as a feedstock to a fuel. In most cases in plants, that's sugar molecules or sugar-like molecules. At the same time, water serves as reducing equivalents and becomes oxidized to dioxygen. Over many decades, scientists have studied this process, and at least at a fairly high level of understanding of the chemistry and the physics that's involved in converting light into chemical potential involves pigments working collectively, electron transfer reactions occurring, and then enzymes that carry out secondary reactions to essentially convert that light that's initially charge separation into stored energy. Unfortunately, due to the complexity of the photosynthetic apparatus, man has to turn to simpler mechanisms. And this slide represents a construct that there are a number of groups around the world working on now, which we might call artificial photosynthetic fuel cells. And the basic idea in concept is that one needs some sort of electrode that either has molecular or perhaps semiconductor light-absorbing properties, and a primary event upon light absorption is charge separation to separate an electron and hole pair. And then ultimately that electron or hole are used to drive, for example, water oxidation. In this case, the electron might come to a counter electrode and then be reduced to carry out a reduction. For example, the reduction of protons to hydrogen, which can be used as a fuel. So this is just a concept, but I'm going to show you how we can actually reduce that to practice in a few minutes. Now, just to give you an idea of the complexity of the reactions that we're talking about, this slide shows two examples. Probably most are familiar with the concept of splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. So in this case, hydrogen would be a fuel. This reaction is, in essence, if you use visible light, requires 4 photons, and it's going to be coupled with 4 electrons. So these are multi-photon, multi-electron processes that require complex chemical systems to carry out. Even more complex would be the reduction of CO2 to methane. In principle, that requires 8 visible photons and 8 electron transfers to carry out. So this reaction is doable at present. The reduction of CO2 to methane is currently not achievable, but these are goals that many researchers have to try to accomplish. So now as background, I'm going to tell you about a construct that's reasonably well developed. It's called a dye-sensitized solar cell, or sometimes in some communities it's just called the Grätzel cell after Michael Grätzel, who was the developer of this idea. A Grätzel cell is not a solar fuel cell, it's a photoelectrochemical cell. So it converts light into electrical power. And the way it does it is using a metal oxide electrode. And the types of metal oxides that are typically used are wide bandgap semiconductors, so they don't absorb visible light. And so what you have to do is play a trick and use what's called a sensitizer, and that's a visible light absorbing molecule that's surface absorbed onto the semiconductor, and that molecule does the work of light absorption. When it's activated, the molecule injects an electron into the semiconductor, so that's the charge separation event. And then in a solar cell, what happens is that the hole that's generated on the oxidized molecule is just regenerated with a redox mediator that basically just shuttles electrons between two electrodes. So this type of cell converts the light into an electrical current, and you can produce power from that. Now, what I'm going to tell you about today is our work towards a more complicated example of this concept. And this is what we call a dye-sensitized photoelectrochemical cell. So in this case, what we're doing is converting light into a chemical or photochemical reaction. And I'll have you focus on this part of the slide, which represents the photoanode. That's where light is absorbed and where charge separation occurs. And the idea is to have a sensitized metal oxide electrode with a molecule or some molecular system that absorbs photons. You get electron transfer into the semiconductor. That produces oxidizing equivalents, which we could think of as holes. And then the trick is that we're going to transfer those holes to some sort of molecular catalyst. In this case, the catalysts that we're after are catalysts that can carry out water oxidation. Now, these catalysts require multiple oxidizing equivalents in order to oxidize water, but that can be accomplished by multiple photon absorption by the sensitizer. So we call these systems, and I'll be talking about them a lot, Chromophore-Catalyst assemblies. In concept, the electrons that are generated by a charge injection can then be brought around to a photocathode where you could essentially carry out the reverse reaction. That would be the conversion of light into reducing equivalents where you might carry out a reduction reaction. And our center is working on this process as well, but today I'm going to tell you mostly about the photoanode side where we're doing water oxidation. Now, by way of introduction to the molecular systems that I'll talk mostly about today, we're using ruthenium compounds quite a lot as sensitizers. These are light-absorbing dyes. In effect, they're prototype examples for molecular systems that can absorb visible light and carry out electron transfer reactions. They're also well known as sensitizers for these type of metal oxide electrodes. They do have some shortcomings, again, that I'll mention a little bit later. Less well known is the fact that there are a number of ruthenium complexes that can also serve as water oxidation catalysts. The first example of one of these systems was developed by Tom Meyer, the director of our center, and that's a ruthenium dimer complex that was reported back around 1982. During the 90s and more recently, there have been a number of what are called single-site water oxidation catalysts, and these are ruthenium compounds that contain only one ruthenium center, and these also can accomplish water oxidation with varying turnover numbers and turnover frequencies. So again, I'll be talking some about these types of catalysts as we go forward. Now, just to give you an example of some of the work that has come out of the center that's been a highlight is the system that I show here. This is a dimeric ruthenium complex that illustrates the features that I've talked about. Namely, there's a ruthenium polypyridine complex, much like ruthenium tris bipyridine. It's functionalized with phosphonate groups which allow it to anchor onto the surface of a metal oxide such as titanium dioxide or tin oxide. That ruthenium is linked to a second ruthenium center, and if you look at this, this is an organometallic ruthenium that has a carbene ligand and some pyridines and then an aqua ligand. This ruthenium complex is a competent water oxidation catalyst. So when it's oxidized up to a high valent state, it can turn over water oxidation. So this assembly, when it's at a metal oxide interface and is illuminated, generates dioxygen by water oxidation, and then the electrons that are injected into the electrode can be collected at a platinum counter electrode and generate hydrogen. So these are two real-time plots showing the oxygen and hydrogen production. The quantum efficiency for this system under monochromatic illumination was about 4%. So this illustrates some features that I'll talk about, but there are some shortcomings in this system. And the first one that I'll focus on is the fact that these types of ruthenium compounds are not particularly broad visible light absorbers. Their light harvesting efficiency is mostly in the blue. This is the absorption spectrum of ruthenium tris bipyridine, and the onset of the absorption is about 475 nanometers. So what you'd like to do is improve the spectral response of the chromophore to enhance its light harvesting ability. So that's the first new concept that I'll talk about, and that's some work that we've done to develop what we call organic chromophore-catalyst assemblies, where what we're trying to do is to use some organic chemistry to enhance the light harvesting ability of these sensitizers. So as a background to this work, I'll mention a collaboration that I've had for about 20 years with John Reynolds, a colleague formerly at the University of Florida, and now John is at Georgia Institute of Technology. And working together a few years ago, we built these molecules that are shown here. These are pi-conjugated organic molecules. This is a thiophene oligomer, but more interesting are molecules such as the one that I'm highlighting here. This is a structure that we call a donor-acceptor-donor type of molecule. The electronic structure makes it a very strong visible light-absorbing dye. For example, this compound is a deep red-orange color. This compound that contains what we call isoindigo has a similar donor-acceptor-donor structure. It's nearly black by eye, and a black dye is essentially a very perfect visible light-absorbing dye. These type of structures have very broad light harvesting ability. You can see the onsets of photocurrent with these dyes in dye-sensitized solar cells are beyond 700 nanometers. So what we sought to do was to use structures like these as adjuvants or chromophores that we could enhance the absorption of our assemblies. And the work that I'm talking about was done by a postdoc by the name of Tuan Pho working in John Reynolds' lab. And he synthesized molecules that I show schematically here, which feature a pi-conjugated unit based on either thiophene oligomer or this donor-acceptor-donor type of structure. And then that's linked into a ruthenium center, which can be a single-site oxidation catalyst. It turns out, as I'll show you in a moment, this isn't the most competent water oxidation catalyst, but it was chosen in part due to synthetic ease, and it does illustrate the concept. The graph shown here shows the absorption spectra of these two different chromophore catalysts compared to just a normal ruthenium polypyridine complex, and you can see very significant enhancement in the light absorptivity, and also the onsets are shifted considerably to the red, making these much more efficient at visible light absorption. Now, one of the hallmarks of our center is that we're not only interested in the application, but also in the science behind it, trying to understand mechanisms and dynamics. So as part of the work that we do, we've used a variety of spectroscopic techniques such as pump probe spectroscopy, which is a laser technique that allows us to monitor intermediates and chemical dynamics occurring of these molecules on time scales ranging from femtoseconds to microseconds after excitation. The work that I'll talk about in a few moments was done by Zachary Morseth, who is a graduate student working with my colleague John Papanikolas, a faculty member at North Carolina. And what Zach was able to do was take these assemblies that I just talked about, in particular this system that has thiophene linked to the ruthenium complex. He had it absorbed onto a TiO2 film and studied the dynamics of what happens after photoexcitation. And that's illustrated here conceptually. These are the structures in concept of these molecules anchored onto a surface of a metal oxide. And these are the spectral results from his transient absorption work. The time scales that are shown here range from about 1 picosecond after excitation out to hundreds of microseconds. So we have essentially many logarithms of time scale. And without going through all the details of the spectroscopy, what I'll tell you that we learned from this is that we know that what happens when these molecules are excited is that the thiophene segment is the primary absorber, and very rapidly, within a few tens of picoseconds, you get an electron injection. That creates a hole on the thiophene, and then on a time scale in the microseconds, you see a second electron transfer, which then oxidizes a ruthenium unit, bringing it ready to do an oxidation step. So we know quite a lot about the photodynamics of these systems on the interfaces. The next question is, can they actually carry out the reactions that we would like to accomplish? And in order to study that, we go to much longer time scales using continuous light photolysis of photoelectrodes and monitoring current on time scales of seconds. And what I'm showing you here are photocurrent traces for illumination of this assembly on a TiO2 electrode when we add various sacrificial reductants. By that, what I mean, these are organic substrates and can give up electrons to the electrode. And what we can see is that as we increase the amount of the sacrificial agent, we see the current coming up. So that does tell us that these assemblies are able to carry out oxidation reactions. Unfortunately, this particular assembly is not able to carry out water oxidation. And the reason is that, as I mentioned previously, this catalyst has a rather low turnover frequency, and it's, in essence, too slow to compete with recombination of electrons coming back from the electrode, so that this assembly can only carry out organic oxidations. Another approach that we've taken quite widely in the center is what we call polymeric chromophore-catalyst assemblies. This approach involves polymer chemistry, and it's shown in this cartoon. The concept is to use a polymer as a scaffold to bring together light-absorbing moieties, chromophores, together on a scaffold with catalyst at varying stoichiometry. The beauty of these systems is in effect that we use the polymer as a scaffold to bring together the active components, and using a type of chemistry that we call click chemistry, it's well known in the chemistry community, it allows us in essence to mix and match polymers with different components rather quickly. And this has been a big part of our work. I'm not going to talk about synthesis at all, but the chemistry that went into developing these reactions took 3 to 5 years of several postdocs and graduate students. But the accomplishment is that now we're able to take a given polymer with a controlled molecular weight or size. It's functionalized in a way that we can very easily attach to it chromophores. For example, shown here would be this ruthenium complex that's functionalized with anchoring groups. We can make the polymer that has these functionalized rutheniums and then use it to anchor the assembly onto the metal oxide surface. And to show you exactly what that looks like in an electron microscope image, what we did here is we stained a film of TiO2 with one of these polymer assemblies, and then we scraped off some of the particles of the titania and looked at them in TEM. And here's the titania, and you can see on the surface there's a coating. The thickness is around 5 to 7 nanometers, and that corresponds roughly to 1 molecular increment of the polymer. So in essence, what we're doing is surface coating the metal oxides with molecular coatings of these polymer assemblies. So to go beyond that, what Junlin Zhang did in his graduate work was to develop what we truly call polymer chromophore-catalyst assemblies. So here again, we use the same polymer backbone. This is a polymer polystyrene. But what Junlin did was attach both light-absorbing chromophores as well as catalyst centers. So this ruthenium that I'm circling is what we call a single site water oxidation catalyst. And we can vary the ratios of these systems, allowing us to control essentially the stoichiometry. Again, this catalyst is not the best for water oxidation, but it is a competent catalyst. And so you'll notice that in this system we don't have anchoring polar groups, which I've alluded to several times in my talk. And so Junlin had to develop an alternative strategy to make films with these systems. And to do that, we used the so-called layer-by-layer technology, which is used widely by Professor Riga here at Mana and by Giro Decker, who developed it in France. The basic idea is that you take two oppositely charged polymers. In this case, we just use polyacrylic acid as an inert, negatively charged polymer. The ruthenium polymers are actually polycations. So we can alternately deposit these two polymers and build up what we call multi-layer films. And this is a top-down electron microscope image of a metal oxide surface that's then been coated with one of these multi-layer films. And you can see the very distinct change in morphology that signals the coating of the surface by these multi-layer chromophore-catalyst assemblies. So using these now surface-modified electrodes, we then turn again to photoelectrochemistry. And here I show again photocurrents enhancement when we add again a sacrificial reagent. So we're able to oxidize organic substrates with this chromophore catalyst assembly by illumination of the electrodes. But in this case, we actually also believe we are able to carry out water oxidation. And what I show here are photocurrents for two different assemblies. The blue one is an assembly that contains no catalyst. It's only the polyruthenium chromophore. We do see some background photocurrent with that, but we see a very distinct, essentially a doubling in the photocurrent when we have the catalyst present in the assembly. And we think that enhanced photocurrent is indeed due to water oxidation. So in the last few minutes, I'll talk about one other approach. I'll go a little bit quickly since I can see I'm about out of time, and I think our session is running a bit long already. But more recently, what we've been trying to do is essentially use self-assembly to bring together the components that we need on the surface. That's shown conceptually here in this concept where we have a metal oxide where we're separately functionalizing it with chromophore units and separate molecular water oxidation catalyst. These are some of the types of chromophores, and you'll recognize these structures from my earlier discussion. These are again donor-acceptor-donor type of dyes that absorb rather strongly in the visible. We study the photoelectric or the electrochemistry, so we know essentially the potentials that are needed to do oxidation. This is actually the catalyst oxidation that's required to activate the catalyst, and each one of these dyes is in essence, when it's oxidized, is strongly oxidizing enough to turn on the catalyst. So the work that I'll talk about here is done by Linda Nguyen and Yu-Kyung working together. And what they've been able to do is build the assembly that I show here that has this visible light absorbing dye that we call TBDT, and this catalyst that we call the sun catalyst. It's named after Li Ching Sun, whose research group developed it. This is a highly competent water oxidation catalyst with a rather high turnover frequency. And the photoelectrochemistry is shown here. And in black is a control experiment where we have an electrode that has only the dye on it. When we add the catalyst, in this case, we see a very distinct enhancement in the photocurrent. And we do know quite clearly that photocurrent enhancement is due to hole transfer from the chromophore to the catalyst, which then activates water oxidation. There are some problems with this system, and you can see that there is a drop-off in the photocurrent, and that has to do with instability of the dye that's due to its reactivity when it becomes oxidized. And that's been quite a focus of some of our recent work, and it's clearly one of the issues that needs to be addressed in the future going forward if we're able to ever apply these in working photoelectrochemical systems. So I think with that, I'll go ahead and finish up. I've told you about several different approaches that we've taken towards this concept of making photoanodes. for solar fuels conversion. We've developed molecular dimer-type complexes, chromophore-catalyst assemblies, and also polymer chromophore-catalyst assemblies. And we study them using transient techniques as well as conventional photoelectrochemistry to gain deep insight into the mechanisms by which they operate. We do think that this area has promise, but clearly there are issues that are concerned with the stability of the photoelectrodes under long-term photolysis, and that's certainly going to be a problem that's going to have to be addressed in the future. Again, so I mentioned the work that I've talked about has been a collaboration between my group, John Reynolds at Georgia Institute of Technology, and Tom Meyer and John Papanikolaou at the University of North Carolina. And I mentioned some of the names of the students and postdocs along the way. The work wouldn't have happened without their able hard work. And as I mentioned, this project is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. So I thank you all very much, and hopefully have time for a few questions or discussion.